we can have the video after the inauguration. Nazish.
Okay, sir. Yes, Father, we can begin.
Good morning, all of you.
Good morning.
I would request Reverend Dr. 𝘠𝘴 our principal, to inaugurate this program with the inaugural speech. Over to you, Father. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor 𝘠𝘂𝑟𝑢p Mitra, and very good morning to all of you, all our respected speakers for this morning. On behalf of St. Xavier's College, Kolkata, I would like to warmly welcome our panelists, Mr. Sandeep Singhal, co-founder of Nexus Venture Partners, Mr. 𝘠𝘠𝘍𝑢𝑟𝑛𝑑𝘴, co-founder of 100x VC and our moderator for the day, Mr. Neeraj Mulani, Director, Startup Community and Engagement, Product 10x. It is my pleasure to inform that this opening ceremony on Entrepreneurship Awareness Camp 2022 is an initiative by the Entrepreneurship Development Cell of our institution to promote the startup culture in our country. The hardest part for a startup is to get a head start into their journey of success and to overcome this very hurdle that EAC was conceptualized to groom young startups and accelerate their entrance into this challenging yet fascinating world of entrepreneurship. EAC has managed to bridge the gap between startups and angel investors, incubators and mentors, making the best resources available for the startups. Over the course of the next 3 days, budding and blooming startups will emerge in the ideal environment for growth and development to happen. In the company of young and passionate, like-minded entrepreneurs, the right tools at their disposal, these entrepreneurs can take giant leaps in establishing a sustainable business, thereby etching their names in the history of entrepreneurship. And especially, I would like to thank our students who are behind this whole program with a lot of support from other faculty members. And especially, I would like to thank Dr. Arup Kumar Mitra for organizing the session with the entire team of very, very enthusiastic students. One thing I would like to tell you, at St. Xavier's, EDC has developed and come to this level. It is because of our committed, sincere students who have taken a lot of initiative to, know our entrepreneur EDC cell at St. Xavier's College. Wishing all the best. Hopefully, we have an enriching and unforgettable session. With these few words, I now declare the Entrepreneurship Awareness Camp 2022 open. Wish you all the best. May God bless you.
Thank you so much, Father, for your words of encouragement. Thank you so much. May I please request our teacher in charge, Dr. Arup Kumar Mitra, to take over.
Good morning, Father. Good morning, our guests, Mr. Neeraj Mulani, Mr. Sandeep Singhal, and Mr. 𝘠𝘠𝘍𝑢𝑟𝑛𝑑𝘴 for this VC or opening VC panel discussion 2022, a program organized by Entrepreneurship Development Cell, which started way back in 2003, and till 2008, it was funded by DST Government of India because they wanted some scientific entrepreneurs to come up. But after 2008, we were of our own. With the able support of the principal, we are going ahead. And of course, as Father said, the enthusiastic group of students who ably pass on the baton, and the next group is equally enthusiastic, and the movement continues. In order to make this program successful, in order to make suitable entrepreneurs or effective entrepreneurs for this country, we have initiated in St. Xavier's something very novel. And that include scientific, innovative entrepreneurs who will be pitching their invention in front of a committee, and they will be screened. And then if selected, they will be getting 50,000 funding from the Entrepreneurship Development Cell of St. Xavier's College. And this program is on, and we actually hope to have a proper niche where the scientific communities or the students of scientific community will join hands with students of commerce and management and take this movement forward. I believe this particular program today is a wonderful step, which is rightly bridging the gap between entrepreneurs and venture capitalists, and at the same time, it will sensitize the students with the entrepreneurship zeal and movement. So I wish all the best for this program, and I really believe that the purpose of this program will actually be successful, and at the end of the day, we will have more successful entrepreneurs from St. Xavier's serving this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for being here, and thank you for your words of encouragement. Thank you, Father. Thank you, sir. May I now please request Mr. Neeraj Mulani to take over. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Father and Professor Mitra, for trusting me with this opportunity. And thank you, Sandeep and Shashank, for joining me on this panel on how to raise venture capital. I'd like to start with a context-setting question for everybody here. So, Sandeep, Shashank, could you give us a bird's eye view of the structure and process of a typical VC deal, starting from pitching or getting to know of the startup right till the term sheet is signed and beyond?
Sure. Maybe I'll go from a more sort of larger VC perspective and how we work with entrepreneurs, right? So normally the approach is, how do we find entrepreneurs? So there are two ways to do it. One is an outreach approach where we are reaching out within the ecosystem to identify companies that are sort of growing, showing scale, and where we believe that our partnership with the company could help them scale faster. The other is people write into us. We have probably 10 to 20 people writing it to us each day, maybe more at times, across our various colleagues and so on, that get emails, phone calls, recommendations. So both models work. When we are getting inbound mails or inbound requests, typically the expectation is that somebody recommends the entrepreneur, and so a warm introduction is always a better way to talk to a VC than just sort of cold calling and writing a mail. From that point onwards, if the idea is something that fits with our interest in what we want to do, and we are sort of looking at the company seriously, then we'll start with the first phase of a meeting to understand what you're doing, get a sense of the team, and then subsequently, again, depending on what stage you are, these things can move pretty quickly and you can make an investment as quickly as a week. In some cases where the company is much further along and there's diligence that is required, it can take a few months. So that varies. You give a term sheet, as you said, that term sheet has various sort of terms, as the name implies. There are various terms of what the investment will be. Valuation is one part of it. There are other terms around, things like liquidation preference and so on, which are all part of us coming in with what is called preferred capital. So we have the preference shares, and then an agreement is signed. Then we start working with the company going forward. So it's a pretty straightforward process. There's no, bells and whistles in that sense. If you are, people that are on this in the audience are students and early stage entrepreneurs. So in that situation, if you don't have a company that's got a lot of prior history behind it, and it's more a concept or a early stage company, then typically this process should not take more than say 4 to 8 weeks. So that's a little bit of a overview from my side.
Yeah. Shashank, would you like to add any specific process points from your end, or is it something pretty standard and dry that's followed across all the VCs?
Thanks, Neeraj, and morning to everybody. Thank you, Xavier's team, and thank you, Neeraj, for having me here. Hi, Sandeep sir, and Sandeep sir has been a icon to reckon with. We've been following his practices over the last many years. So what Sandeep sir said is largely what every VC is trying to do. In our case, since we are a very early stage seed fund, we are dependent on the likes of Sandeep sir's fund to fund our portfolio companies and many other growth stage VC funds. At a seed fund, we are looking at all the parameters which were mentioned, but ours is slightly different because we don't want to value the company right up front. So we don't do shareholders round, and hence we have created an iSafe document, which is emulating the US model of safe instrument created by Y Combinator. So our model is that we give fixed capital for fixed term through a convertible preference share, which is safe, iSafe. And we work with very early stage founders, which are typically right after an ideation stage from an MVP to early traction. But rest all the parameters in terms of identification, receiving applications, as Sandeep sir mentioned, remain same.
Shashank, maybe you want to talk about your cohort model and how it's different. The 100x is very different from a traditional VC.
Correct.
In the way you engage with the ecosystem and you build the cohort.
Correct. So thanks for pointing that out. So for everybody's 100x is actually working at the bottom of the Series A funds. There are Series A funds, and then there are private equity funds, and we are sort of a pre-seed and seed. Nomenclature can be anything. Our objective is to be the first check in very early stage entrepreneurs, particularly fresh out of college, who need to get more metric driven. As a function of that, we have taken on a different approach, as I mentioned, emulating the Y Combinator model for India, which means that we invest in one go in a large set of companies through iSafe, which enables us to close these investments within a week to 10 days in a set of companies. So our first set of company, which we call class, which is batch or cohort, was a set of 20 companies. We deployed capital in all these 20 companies, which are very sector agnostic, and then start working with them in terms of GTM, distribution, getting them more market ready, and then getting them ready for a VC pitch day, which is their opportunity to pitch to investors like Sandeep sir and many other VCs and angels to get the next level of funding going, which is again dependent on the nomenclature, seed, pre-series A, so on and so forth. So we typically have done now 70 investments, announcing balance 10 investments very soon through a VC pitch day. And cumulatively, we've been successful in raising, roughly $60 million USD post our investment collectively, cumulatively for these portfolio companies, which has made them reach a pre-series A to series A. So again, in the pyramid structure, we're at the bottom of the pyramid. We want to be a discovery fund for a large set of opportunities, which are very early. And we source most of our companies from, incubation centers, accelerators, student communities, so on and so forth.
Right. Thank you for that. In fact, that helps quite a lot of our audience, because I think Product NX, where I'm working at, it's an accelerator. So that is an accelerator trying to make startups fund ready. And then we have Shashank, who would be writing those first checks, and then the startups graduating to Sandeep sir's funds. I think we'll be able to cover the wider continuum. I'd like to go back to something that Sandeep sir mentioned, that there are 2 or 3 different sources of trying to find startups. There'd obviously be a lot of inbound queries coming in from startups, but the VC fund is also trying to nitpick and try and source these startups from their end, more of an outbound reach. It's usually from an outside looking in perspective, the people would think that VCs are usually spoiled for choice. There are a lot of startups reaching them for funding. So they may not have been engaging in outbound or sourcing for startups. But what kind of a proportion do you think exists for you in terms of startups that you invest in? How many are inbound queries versus you guys actually trying and reaching out to these on your own?
So I would say probably half and half. The best entrepreneurs are ones that are too busy building their businesses to go and raise capital actively. So they are building sustainable businesses that busy hiring people, they're busy getting clients and so on. And so it's very important that we have a sort of our ears to the ground to be able to recognize them early and find them early. So it's not that those are your, like I said, there is no probabilistic thing in that which is going to be more successful or not. But just from a standpoint of you have to be in the market, and in many cases that outreach is equally important for us to understand what's happening in the market. So it's not just that we're doing an investment, but in many cases you're just going out there and meeting companies and getting to know them, even when they're not fundraising. So there will be situations where we'll call a founder and they'll say, oh no, we don't need money for the next 1 year. We said that's okay, even if you don't need money, let's understand what you're doing. How can we help? We actually even help companies that we haven't funded, with the hope that when they are raising money, they will be friends with us and give us take our money. So it's not a our goal is that we want to be the best entrepreneurs. So it is competitive in that sense, and you're not really just waiting for people to show up at your door and say, hey, I want money, right? So it's both ways.
Got it. And in terms of like you mentioned, that the market is very competitive, and it is VCs also trying to find the next unicorn. And there will always be some investments that do exceedingly well and some that fail. And often the failed startups teach us more than the successful startups. So what are some of the key lessons that you've learned from investing into the startups that have failed? Shashank, I'll let you go first here, and then we also hear in Sandeep sir's view.
So, our approach is slightly different from a larger VC, because we are backing very, very early stage founders, and we are doing quantity as well, right?
Yeah.
And therefore it needs to be very, very process driven at our end. And when we do something like a portfolio management for 70 odd companies, the winners tend to get more attention, and the folks who are not taking feedback would not get enough attention, because it's a function of time. Now, when we are looking at companies, we are in our portfolio companies, when we're trying to see if they can take feedback and they can continuously grow and scale. And that requires a lot of time, that requires a lot of effort. The objective is to get them more metric driven. In our model, we are assuming that 10 to 15% companies will fail, right? But the objective is, can we find diamonds in the rough, right? And help get them polished, get them more metric driven, right? Because we might come in at a hope and invest at hope, but the growth stage VC will then look at metric driven businesses. So what can we bring onto the table in terms of getting them more metric driven? And in that process, we'll end up, our process post investment also would be, can we identify the right set of winners for the next follow-on investors? So we will end up getting a lot of folks who will not end up. Sorry, sir.
No, go ahead. No, I thought you were done. Yeah, go ahead.
So in that process, you'll end up finding a lot of folks who will go up the ladder. In our portfolio companies, we've had one acqui-hire and one set of two companies which were victims of COVID. The rest were able to go to the next level. and move on. So yes, in the bottom of the pyramid, you'll have many failures also, but then you'll end up having winners, and winners will always get the attention. Sandeep sir, good to go.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to, I think what Shashank was saying, so at an early stage, it's very, the risk of failure is much higher, right? Now, that's how the ecosystem works, is that the earlier the company, the more risky it is. And as you build the business, you take more and more risk out. So I think what Shashank was outlining is in the context of defining metrics, defining a business model that can actually be replicated and so on, you're effectively taking out risk. So the whole idea is at each stage of investment, you are reducing the risk of the business in terms of scaling and not failing. So I just want to sort of maybe step back and I'll talk a little bit about what are the criteria that we look for, which we think will end up being a successful investment, right?
Yeah.
So there are 4 broad criteria that we work on. So the first one is always the team. What is the quality of the team? Even if it's, the business may be on paper, right? You haven't really started it, but what are the things that really sort of, make an entrepreneur more likely to succeed? And those relate to an ability to, number one, articulate the problem that they're trying to solve. So you have to have clarity on what is the problem and how are you going to address it. Second is, in that articulation, there is a sort of a sales aspect to it, right? When you're articulating something, you're always trying to sort of sell why you are the best person to be solving that problem. And that salesmanship is very important because you're selling to employees, you're selling to investors, you're selling to customers. So it's as an entrepreneur, you're 24/7 in sales mode. So that's if you don't enjoy sales, don't be an entrepreneur. You have to be in that mindset. And the third thing is the ability to listen and adapt. It's very important because you may come in with a certain mindset of what is the problem and how you want to solve it. As you get into the market may tell you otherwise. The market may say, oh, this is not really the problem that we have. This is the, maybe it's an adjacent issue or it's a different way to solve the problem or something like that, right? So that ability to hear what the market is telling you and adapting accordingly is very important. So that's what we are testing for when we are doing our original first meeting. The first meeting is really to understand, does this team have the ability to do these things? The second aspect is, are you targeting a large market? And you may actually initially start with a very focused approach. So your initial sort of market size, that it may appear maybe a very small market because you're focusing, but you should be able to communicate that if you were to solve this problem for this focused area, you can potentially scale this to a much larger market. So that's the second thing that we look for, is that fundamentally, do you have a very large market in mind and how are you going to solve that problem? Third is what we call sustainable competitive differentiation, right? So, and it's very important that you may come into the market with a sort of differentiated solution, but at some point people will figure it out and copy it. Right? So you need to be always on your toes to figure out, how am I going to remain competitive and ahead of the curve from anybody else? So that's where the sustainability of that competitive differentiation becomes very important. And the final thing we look for is capital efficiency, where we say, okay, how much capital will you deploy to build out your business? So you come to me and you say, okay, I'm going to do say consumer business, and I'm going to get to a revenue of $1 million, and it'll take me $100 million to get there. It'll be tough for me to sort of justify it, right? But if you come to me and say, okay, I'm going to build a business that's going to go to 10 million in revenue, and I need $2 million to get there, it suddenly becomes very interesting. Right? So capital efficiency is the last part of the sort of 4 things we look at. Going back to your question on what is the, what are failures that you see? The failures get related to mostly these 4 points. And, people are, as an entrepreneur, you are taking risk. You are saying, okay, here's a problem to be solved, and here's how I'm going to solve it. Sometimes you may think it's a big problem. I may agree with you also, but ultimately the market tells you it's not a big problem. And at that point, you're saying, hey, what do I do from here? So people, pivot and they do other things and so on. Some entrepreneurs find it very hard to do that. They keep butting their heads against the wall where the market is telling you otherwise, but you are not willing to listen. Big problem, and that's a big cause of failure.
Yep.
The second failure is that you're not the only one who's seeing the problem. There are probably 20 other entrepreneurs that are also seeing the same problem. Somebody else may find a better solution. So you can come into a market, you may have initial traction because maybe you're working in in your city, or you're working in a small area, but somebody else you're working in Calcutta, somebody else is working in Delhi, and the person in Delhi builds a better product and makes your product irrelevant, right? So none of your fault, but that can happen. And I think the third thing is that businesses do go through catastrophic events, right? So Shashank mentioned this point of COVID. So COVID has had both a positive and a negative impact on our portfolio. So some of the digital companies have done extremely well, much better than they had projected to us, whereas some of the companies that had a more physical presence have really been impacted very negatively, right? So again, some of these things are not in your control, but again, if you have the ability to adapt and the ability to listen to what the market is telling you, typically you won't be, the likelihood of failure is much lower. So,
yeah. So I think you raise a very interesting point here, and this is probably a founder's dilemma, where while the founder may try to, listen to the market, how do you tread that fine balance of pivot versus perseverance? Because there will be countering views for both the arguments. Where do you, put your attention? Who do you listen to? And how do you make that call on pivot versus persevere?
Shashank, you want to go first?
So, my opinion on that is two different things: perseverance and persistent, right? I mean, one is naysayers and people saying, "Ye mat karo, you're not cut out for that." That's and going ahead and believing in what you do is different at an early stage, right? The other, as Sandeep sir said, right, figuring out the market. And in the initial days, at least at our level also, this continues as you grow up, is that the biggest indicator is increasing metrics, increasing sales of a product, the utility of the product, right? Agar wohi nahi ho raha hai early days mein, then that is the biggest indicator to pivot, in our opinion. And perseverance is, I mean, you can't be dogmatic about it, right? I need to do it, I need to prove something. It's not that. You need to be not fall in love with your product. You need to be realistic. You're building a business and it needs to sell and it needs to scale. If you're walking the venture capital fundraising path, it needs to continuously scale exponentially. And those initial indicators, if they are not there in the beginning, then those are signs of pivot. That's how we'll define it in the early stages.
Yeah, I think, Shashank made a very important point around the metric-driven thinking, right? So it's not just the investor that is helping you define metrics. You as an entrepreneur need to have clarity on what metrics matter to you as you build a business. See, for us, it's giving you capital. For you, it's giving your life's time, right? So time is much more important than capital. I can always generate capital elsewhere, but you can't generate your time elsewhere, right? Your time is your time. If it goes away, it's gone. So that's one feedback we give to all our entrepreneurs, that, how to think about pivot versus persevere is more important to you as a founder than it is to us as an investor. And so the metrics that Shashank is mentioning are very important, that you need to be able to see improving efficiencies in the various areas that matter to scalability, right? If you're not seeing that, then you have to do a sort of, introspection, that am I actually trying to solve a problem that doesn't need to be solved, or am I solving it the wrong way? And that again is so I'm just outlining there are two paths, right? So one path is to say the problem doesn't exist the way I thought it existed. The second is to say the problem exists, but I haven't found the solution in the right way. And that also has an impact on how you move forward. So there are situations where people will redesign their product to address the same problem and be successful. In other cases, people just say, okay, the problem isn't there. I'll go find another problem to solve, right? So Slack is a classic example. The guy started in a different space, realized that what he was trying to solve wasn't working, but this product that he had for communication was working very well. So he just killed the rest of the business and just became a communication platform. So, those things, some of them are serendipity, some of them are thought through, but it's very important for an entrepreneur to know what is it that they are measuring for themselves, to say, I'm going to spend another year of my life doing this.
Right. And this matrix approach, again, I think Shashank, like you touched upon, is trying to de-risk the startup, right? What would be some of these processes that you try and inculcate to, de-risk the startup, especially knowing that at an early stage, the risk of failure is that high?
So we are very sector agnostic. We've invested in multiple companies. Some are deep tech, some are SaaS, some are D2C. All of them go through a very different journey in the early stages. Our objective, as soon as we've given them our seed capital, is to ensure they've taken money and they're getting responsible in terms of, and I'll start with the reverse, investor relations, reporting their KPIs, their MISs on a monthly basis. Getting that habit inculcated is very, very important at these at this stage. Then the next is their GTM. If they have a plan for 6 months, have they broken it down on a month-on-month basis? How much do they want to achieve? For instance, if it's a brand or a D2C brand, have they figured out distributors or retailers? Walking whatever plan they presented on a theoretical level, getting it practically executed. As at our level, it's more of execution and what they can achieve, right? Because as I said, we are largely coming in and investing in at hope, right? Our business, because we are also not converted into equity, to ensure the success of the business, to get them metric driven so that they're able to raise the next round. The whole journey involves multiple steps, and one of them being investor relations, getting them that mindset created. Second is helping them in any capacity, getting them, if it's a SaaS business, getting them certain introductions, ensuring that the product is working. If the product needs to be done. So those are the parameters which we guys are working at. And as soon as the funding happens from our side, we straight away dive into those aspects with our portfolio companies.
Right. And with these investor relation kind of metrics and processes that where you're trying to establish that, the startup is providing you with the right kind of information, with the right kind of, they are doing their groundwork, right? One of the key aspects that accelerators as well as VCs would judge for is how passionate and determined the founders are. But with such a subjective aspect, how do you go about establishing the same?
It's, Sandeep sir can also add. I'll just quickly give my views. I think once you continuously do investments and you meet a lot of founders, I think it boils down to human psychology and human breeding, right? There are a lot of these indicators. Not everything will be determined by the data or supply or timely intervention of data, while data will continue to play a major role. It's a combination of all these aspects. More data, more metric as you keep growing, more psychological or human interaction based and how they're behaving, their responsibility. But either way, of all the follow-on investors we've had in our portfolio companies, I've always seen the growth stage VCs, the pre-series A VCs, being very happy when they're getting quarterly or monthly updates from the founders. And it's not passion; it's about numbers. Then, right? They've managed to scale, which is a good indicator that their confidence that they've backed the right company. Be the guy responsible to update the existing investor, right? So even during a rough patch, they're saying this is the actual figure. So it boils down to trust, right? But yeah, Sandeep, so your views on the same?
Yeah, no, I think there is in every VC conversation, or even at an accelerator level or whatever, any entrepreneur that is expecting to sort of pitch to a fund, to an accelerator, where there are resources that they are expecting to get from that other person, needs to be able to convince that person as to why they should be the ones given it versus somebody else. Right? Today, as we all know, the number of startups in India is very, very large, and we get, and Shashank probably even more so, gets, a lot more early stage companies approaching them. And these early stage companies in many cases may have a proof of concept, but in a lot of cases may just be two people getting together and saying, hey, we think we can build this out. And the first question that you should expect, all of you should expect us to ask is, why are you doing this? Right? What is the fundamental point is, what is the sort of core reason that's driving you to take time out of whatever else you can do in life to do this particular thing? Entrepreneurship is a very, very lonely journey. You'll hear a lot of people say this. And the reason why you're doing this has to be that firm and that strong, that when you get into these situations where things are not going the way that you expect them to, you won't, falter, you won't waver. You said, why am I doing this, kind of thing, right? So it's very important in that context to get that feeling from the entrepreneur as to, this is really, really something that they're passionate about. We have situations where teams come to us and say, oh, we wanted to do something as a startup. So we boiled the ocean. We looked at what things are happening, what things are getting funded and all that stuff. And we decided to do this. Big red flag for us, right? We will stay away from those type of entrepreneurs, because they're doing a startup because of the sake of doing a startup, not because they're passionate about the problem they're trying to solve. So it's as Shashank mentioned, it's sort of an art more than a science. That is going to ask questions from different ways. So as a founder, don't be frustrated if during a course of a 1 hour meeting you feel like that same question is getting asked to you, because what we're trying to do is trying to triangulate. 3 people in the room may ask you this, and in different ways. You're saying, "Hey, I just answered that question. Why are you asking to me again?" But the point is, we're just triangulating and saying, okay, is this guy really going to stick it out? Wrong. So that's that's sort of, it's just through conversations.
Right. I think it's reassuring to hear that there is still a human relations aspect to investing rather than just numbers and data driving these decisions.
It is only by the way, just to be clear, numbers matter, but fundamentally entrepreneurship and supporting entrepreneurs is only about a human relationship. So that, even a large company is fundamentally about human relationships. The fact that Elon Musk just wrote a check into Twitter had nothing to do with Twitter numbers.
Yeah. And Sandeep sir, you touched upon something interesting that I'd like to dig deeper into is red flags, right? When you're trying to talk to founders, and there are some of these red flags that completely, take you south, take the deal south. What would be some of these red flags that that you would specifically look out for?
Okay, so it starts with this notion of just unearthing the passion of the person to do what they're trying to do. Number one. Number two is, if you're a team and you're presenting as a team, we're trying to understand the cohesion and the collaboration within the team, right? So if you get a sense that there is a lack of cohesion in the team, then then again that's a red flag we'd sort of stay away from. Third is what I mentioned earlier, in the sense of listening capability, and we'll sort of push you, right? In a meeting, we may present a different point of view, not from a standpoint that we don't agree with your point of view, but what we're testing is, hey, if I put a different point of view, do you listen to my point of view and react to it, and how do you react to it, right? So we'll also be looking at this ability to adapt and listen. And other times it's obviously you're selling to us anyway, so that whole notion of motivation, sales and all is fine, but it's really these 3 broad things that I just mentioned, which has to do with your passion coming through, your team dynamics are good, and third is this thing about adaptability and willingness to listen.
Right. And there will be some very eloquent and talented entrepreneurs who are sales first, and they may be able to, get through some of these filters and still end up getting a deal. But having been in business with them, I'm sure if there are some of these instances where you feel that, they're still not living up to the promises that were made, how would or a VC, early stage or growth stage, approach that kind of situation?
See, when you start a company, you don't have a full team in almost all cases, right? So as an entrepreneur, if you have shown me that you have the passion, you have the ability to convince others, and quote unquote sales, but I also term it motivation, that you can motivate others to align with you, right? So that sales appears very, people find sales and they sort of switch off, right? So I actually think that motivating others to align with you is a better way to sort of describe it. And there are situations where you will have a very strong person who is able to do that, but is unable to execute, for example, right? And you recognize that and you say, okay, I'll partner this person with a strong execution person. And between the two of them, so now the question that becomes is this person have the ability to recognize and sort of recruit, quote unquote, recruit this person to come and work with them. And what we would typically do in that situation is we would not invest till we have got that person to do that. So it's not like, okay, we'll give you the money and we'll then work with you to find the person. We'll say, okay, let's find that person jointly. There may be some people that are in our network that we'll introduce you to. Think about this, think about this role and try and find the person. Again, this goes back to listening and adaptability. And if that person agrees with our point of view and does that, then we'll say, okay, and we'll give you the money.
Right. Sandeep, Shashank, your views on this?
I think I echo the same points. I just adding two more points because at an early stage, I think two criteria we look out for, which are huge red flags. Those are happening. One is if it's a co-founding team, the founders need to be full-time. Because if they're not full-time and if they're moonlighting this project, right? That's a risk we cannot take, even though early stage investment is risky. So that does not echo commitment. If a founder says, boss, I've broken my FDs and now I've left my job and I'm reaching escape velocity and I'm out of fuel, please fund me, as opposed to a founder saying, I'm building a rocket and I need to hire a truck to get material. We will definitely not fund the guy who's wanting to get a truck. The second point is also we asked, while we're giving small capital, which was 25 lakhs up till last week, we recently announced an increase in check size, 1.25 crores. But even for the 25 lakhs, we were asking each founder, can you show us how are you going to use and utilize this capital? Now, this is I'm speaking this in open forum, but and because founders should know, we rejected businesses despite the fact they had some potential, where we saw 25% above consumption in personal salaries by founders. So that is another red flag for us, where founders think at a very early stage they need to generate income, at least at the seed level, and their priority should be wealth creation. So just adding to Sandeep sir's points, these are the two additional points which we look for.
Right. I think which is why we see that VCs often try and bias towards founders that are blue collar founders or blue collar CEOs, because who've been there on the field know how to actually execute as well, rather than just being the visionary and doing the top level thinking. Right. And
I won't use a term blue collar. That's I would say
correct.
It's the hunger that the founder is demonstrating, right? I think Shashank made a very important point that for an entrepreneur, wealth creation is the driving factor, not sort of salary. And I find it very interesting when people make those choices in terms of, I'll take a lower salary but give me more equity. That's our, even when we are hiring the next level down, that's what we're looking for, people who are willing to make that trade-off. And so for a founder, that becomes even more critical.
Right. And this is obviously going to be one of the topics of conversation during the due diligence. But could you also shine some light on the other aspects of due diligence that you'd go through before taking on a startup as an early investor or as a growth investor?
So apart from the team, as I mentioned, the market size is very important. So we do diligence on how large can this market be. So the founder will share a point of view with us, but you do end up talking to experts in that space and so on to understand, okay, is that really what you're seeing? So if somebody comes and says, I've built a solution that will, that every FMCG company will pay $1 million for, we'll talk to 5 FMCG companies and say, will you pay $1 million for this, right? So there is validating the market size and so on. It's also validating and diligencing if you have technology. Is that technology truly distinctive? Is there any IP risk there? Have you, sort of used IP that you should not have used, and so on? So there is the how aspect of what you're doing, and then at later stages, obviously there's a lot of hygiene things like finance and legal and so on, which may not be as relevant for the folks who are listening right now.
Right.
Shashank, from your side? Yeah.
Same, Sandeep, sir. I think 1, 2 or 3 things which we look at very early stage is incorporation of the company, because you're investing in very early stage. This is not relevant to growth stage, but bottom of the pyramid would be we want to invest in companies which are already registered, and some of the companies we encounter who are bootstrapped, because we are only investing in bootstrap. They are operating businesses for the last 5-6 years, right? So they might have loans on the book. Now that is something which we look out for in our due diligence process, over and above market opportunity, product, speaking with the customer, potential customer, or validating that opportunity, is that structurally they should not have diluted equity, because we are the first check into the company. If they've already diluted significant capital, or they've given 10% to, let's say, friends and family, that by the structure of our fund makes it late for us. So that is one more important thing which we look out for in our due diligence process. While these are very early stage companies, but you'd be surprised at some of the mistakes founders make in the euphoria and enthusiasm of setting up companies, that they end up diluting up to 50% to friends and family, right? And so those kind of checks are also very important, because they will become irrelevant even if they're performing, and even if we end up funding them, they will not be ready for a growth stage VC fund, because it's just heavy dilution. They'll possibly end up owning 15% by the time they reach Series A, if they do, right? So that parameter is something which we look very closely as well.
And as part of this due diligence, there may not be any red flags that come up, but there may still even be some instances where you feel that the startup shouldn't fundraise. What might be those situations for you?
No, there has to be some red flag to get to that point. You would either feel like, okay, your product isn't ready yet. Your product market fit isn't quite what you had expected it to be. You think that you'll get to that $1 million per FMCG client, but they're telling you this is a 200K sort of thing. So maybe you need to build a wider product and so on. So typically there is some gap between what the founder has sort of committed or shown as milestones to achieve for the capital that they're raising, versus what our diligence is telling us that they could achieve with that same capital.
Yes, I think adding to that point, I think if the founders have a mindset of a lifestyle business, right? So a lot of people say, I'll go to a VC, I'll raise the first check, but don't have the mindset to continuously walk that treadmill, right? So I think that becomes one red flag, right? So and that is one of the things which we'll evaluate very early on in a founder.
Right. I think what you touch upon is raising funds for social validation that, as an entrepreneur, I've made it, rather than, having a plan on how do you actually deploy the funds.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a good
I
point.
I think we're approaching the end of the panel discussion. I'd like to end this panel with one question, especially considering that, we in our audience, we have a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs. What advice would you give to these young aspiring entrepreneurs that you think would really improve the entrepreneurial ecosystem for the country?
So, today being an entrepreneur, doing a startup is seen as being it's the cool thing to do, right? And my biggest piece of advice for people who are on this call is don't do something because it's the cool thing to do. Do it because it's the right thing to do for yourself. Going and working at another startup or going and working at a Google can be equally fulfilling. Not everybody is cut out to be a founder, and it may not be the right time in your life to be a founder. So it's very important to think through whether the 4 criteria that I mentioned are really sort of applicable to your situation. Are you uniquely placed to solve a problem? Is it a large enough problem? Can you do it in a way which is differentiated? And is it capital efficient? I think if you and be objective about it. So that would be my biggest my advice.
My advice to the founders would be that you are in 2022. Sandeep sir will also agree with this, that this ecosystem is very different from what you had in 2008, right? So today these new entrepreneurs have the example of second-time entrepreneurs, unicorns being built up, which are turned into larger corporations, right? So if they are serious about building businesses, then there are stories, there are experiences which they can leverage, which many of the successful entrepreneurs did not have access to and the opportunity to a decade ago. So if you are starting, no better time, because there are a lot of resources, but either way, as Sandeep sir said, that you still will have to understand your journey and take a deeper dive into it. But if you're planning to do it, no better time than 2022. It's just a great time for India and first-time entrepreneurs.
I think that's absolute quality advice to all the young entrepreneurs and aspiring entrepreneurs. We do have some startups in our audience. In case anybody has questions for Sandeep sir or Shashank, please go ahead. In case there aren't any questions from the Zoom, okay, yeah, Vedant, please go ahead.
Yes, sir. So first of all, thank you very much for this insightful session. Sir, so as we know that, so from a VC standpoint, how do you differentiate while investing in various ventures between the adequate amount of diversification among sectors and over diversification? Like what is the various kind of sectoral allocation that you have observed in your cohort base, or while you're investing in startups that are approaching you recently, what is the kind of sectoral allocation that you have observed?
So for 100x.vc, our vision is to invest in 100 companies a year. We've done only 70, but we are very sector agnostic. And while we want to focus on sectors, but I think it's a learning process, and you'll be surprised, guys, that we learn a lot from founders than driving a thesis per se, right? So what we see from founders pitching into us, we realize that this ABC model or sector they're building their startup in is something which will scale over the next 9 months based on what value we can bring onto the table. I think that is one of these selection criteria, rather than deciding at the beginning of the year that I'm going to do 4 fintech deals and 4, let's say Web3, right? Because it's as much as a learning process for us at our stage. We're seeing multiple ideas, multiple models emerging. We are constantly updating ourselves by studying certain sectors, right? but we don't have a specific sectors defined in our mind. What we do look at is, if a company is approaching and we like them, is that what value can we bring in the next 90 to 120 days to enable the next fundraise and accelerate their growth to a Series A. Anything in between is what we try and answer.
Nothing from my side on this.
Shashank, we do have a question for you from our YouTube live. You mentioned that attitude and passion of entrepreneurs matter a lot. So obviously, when the founders go that extra mile and ensure that the VCs and the investors are receiving those quarterly updates, which go along with building the trust. Have you observed entrepreneurs changing their attitude post funding, for the worse or for the better? And how would you tackle that situation?
No, we see that a lot. So that's why I said at the beginning of the conversation, you have to inculcate that process, because they feel they've arrived in life if they raise the check, right? And that doesn't work, because now they're more responsible. They need to be more responsible, right? For the follow-on investors. And it just keeps getting more and more, a combination of responsibility. So we've seen, there are founders who don't want to report, who don't want to delegate, who don't want to form a structured team, don't want to follow an MIS, but it's very important to do all of that.
Right. Yeah, I think we are at the end of our session then. Thank you so much, Sandeep sir. Thank you, Shashank, for shining light on the entire VC industry. I'm sure the audience appreciates all your insights.
All the best to everyone. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much,
Thank
sir.
you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandeep sir. Thank you, Neeraj.
May I please request Ishita to give the vote of thanks?
After such a spellbinding session, it is an absolute honor and my pleasant duty to propose the vote of thanks on behalf of the Entrepreneurship Development Cell of St. Xavier's College, Kolkata. With immense appreciation and gratitude, I thank Mr. Sandeep Singhal and Mr. Shashank Randev for being present with us today and taking out time from their busy schedule to furnish the young minds with such practical and valuable inputs about the fundamentals of venture capital. A special thanks to Mr. Neeraj Malani for moderating and conducting this session today. We are sure that the learnings from this discussion will act as a guiding light and hold our audience in good stead for the future. A special mention to our respected principal, Reverend Dr. Dominic Savio, and our vice principals, Reverend Father Joseph Kolendai, Reverend Father Peter Arokium, and Professor Bertram D. Silva for encouraging us to pursue greatness and live up to the great Xaverian reputation. I would further like to thank our faculty advisor, Dr. Arup Kumar Mitra, for his leading supervision and inspiration at every juncture. A big thank you to our audience for being patient, interactive, and putting forth such compelling questions. Last but not the least, I would extend a deep sense of appreciation for all the support, timely implementation, and guidance provided by the members of the Entrepreneurship Development Cell. We owe the success of the session to you. Once again, thank you all for tuning in with EDC. Have a pleasant day.
Thank you, Sheila. Thanks, Shashank.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.